Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz, and with us today is Professor of Political Science and Director of the PPE Certificate Program at Duke University. He is also author of many articles, including Elon Musk, Tigers, and the Nature of Bureaucracy, which he is here to discuss with us today. Professor, welcome back to the show.
It is a pleasure. Thank you.
So in your article, you talk about viewing bureaucracies from the public choice perspective. What is the public choice perspective?
Public choice originated in the 1950s and 1960s as a response to what was called then the public interest theory of government. The usual theory was, people pointed out, and rightly, that markets functioned in a way that created some problems. There could be concentrations of power. There could be information that sellers have that buyers don't have. Like if I'm trying to sell you a drug and I claim it cures cancer, you have a hard way of knowing. It's hard for you to know if that's true. There are problems with fraud. So we look at markets, we see a bunch of problems. The way that the logic went was, well, since markets have these problems, we should use the state. And public choice people said, whoa, Scooter, not so fast. It's true enough that markets have problems, but where is this ideal thing you call the state? One of the difficulties was for public choice that people thought that consumers weren't smart enough to solve problems about maybe how much butter to eat, but voters could somehow solve the problem of dealing with the Soviet Union. Those are the same people. And actually, the fundamental public choice insight is that every problem with consumers is worse with voters. Voters have the same problems of asymmetric information. Voters can be fooled by promises of free stuff. So if you know nothing else about public choice except every problem with consumers is worse in voters, you have a pretty good flavor of it. So the difficulty is we have to come up with, and it's complicated. It's actually hard for people on both sides, the pro-market people and the pro-government people. It's hard to come up with it's hard to settle on the idea that we have to decide these things case by case. Neither system is always better.
Okay, now, one of the things with the creation of this new Doge, the Department of Government Efficiency, I don't know exactly what they're going to do, and we'll get into that, but it seems one of the things they're going to do is help the government bureaucracies, or they want to help them to be more efficient. What exactly is a bureaucracy?
Well, there's a bunch in that question. The idea of creating a bureaucracy to help bureaucracy is just ironic enough on its face that we should stop and enjoy that for a moment.
Sip of water.
Well, so we think of when before I said markets, markets are peopled by people. There's buyers, there's sellers, there's people that work, there's capitalists, people who invest. I kind of know what that looks like. When I say government, what do you think of? And the answer for most people is elected officials. Well, that's clearly not government. So if I say, boy, I've got to go get a new driver's license, I'm going to have to go talk to the governor. The point of the spear of government, the delivery point for government is never elected officials. It is almost always someone who is appointed under a system of rules, ordinances, regulations. They have good knowledge of the book. There's always some long book that contains what all the rules are, and we have to follow these procedures. And there's a reason for that. The reason that we have these procedures is to make sure of two things. First, there's no corruption. That is, I can't pay and get better service. I can't bribe people and get my way around the rules. And the second is, and it's related, but it's different, is rule of law, which is that everyone in a government system faces exactly the same set of regulations. So there's no differences in power. In an elected system, there's going to be differences in power. And so Max Weber, the famous German sociologist and social theorist, didn't invent bureaucracy, but Weber gives the justification for bureaucracy as a system that replaces previous systems that had no rational character. Bureaucracy is rational in the sense we specify a set of rules, and then we have experts to enforce those rules. And what we get from that seems pretty valuable. It's called rule of law. So bureaucracies are the organizations that specialize in the hierarchical organization of delivery of the goods and services that government provides. And the idea of bureaucracy is not necessarily efficiency as much as it is fairness. But in principle, bureaucracies could be fair because they are the only provider of these goods and services. We don't have all the inefficiency and chaos that comes from competition in the market system. So Weber actually thought that there would be much more efficiency from bureaucracy because bureaucracy can just straightforwardly provide the good or service. I don't have to worry about all the expenditures on advertising, expenditures on profits. Costs should be much lower than in a bureaucratic system than we would expect them to be in a capitalist system.
Weber argued, correct me if I'm wrong, that as societies become more and more advanced, they become more and more bureaucratic, right?
He thought that was both empirically true and that it was an improvement because bureaucracy by its nature is an improvement over other systems. Partly because if we have a better and better set of rules that result from expertise. So instead of this, he was an elitist. He didn't think much of democracy, and he actually wouldn't disagree with my claim. Consumers and voters both don't know very much. But you know who knows a lot? Experts. And so Max Weber, when he looked in the mirror, said, there's an expert. Damn, you look good. Have you lost weight? Don't you ever die. So almost everyone, when they want to solve these problems, they imagine that there is this, at least one person that's just smarter and better than everyone else. And it is, no surprise, themselves. And they come up, Rousseau did this, Jean-Jacques Rousseau did this. He is the person called the lawgiver, which is basically the first contractarian bureaucrat. We're going to have all of progressivism comes from Rousseau and Weber, these idea of experts who will do what voters would want if voters were as smart as the experts. We all implicitly recognize voters are not smart enough to do what they should want. And so voters rationally, this is the logical step, voters rationally should want to delegate their own decision-making power to people who can use it better than these poor morons can. They're smart
I,
enough to know that.
I remember after the economic collapse of 2008, and I was having a debate with somebody, and I was pointing out to him the government's role in causing the problem. And he kept accusing me. I don't know if accusing is the right word, but he kept thinking that I was somehow defending bankers. But what I was talking to him about was incentive structures, that the government was incentivizing banks to create risky loans. It had nothing to do with the character of bankers one way or the other. It had everything to do with the fact that human beings respond to incentives. And one of the things you touched on in your article is the different incentives that govern bureaucracies as juxtaposed with markets. Can you explain that a little bit?
First, on the question of the debate, this is sort of a recurrent thing. So yes, it was greedy bankers in 2008 and 2009. Recently, when there was inflation, Elizabeth Warren said it was greedy corporations.
Right.
I don't disagree with that a bit. You can't blame dogs for eating out of the garbage. It's what dogs do. So there were people who were pursuing profits and revenues. The thing that's hard to explain is why these things reached a peak in 2008, 2009, and then declined dramatically. Greed went away until about 2022, when all of a sudden there was an enormous resurgence of greed. Greed is the fundamental backlying underground, the factor that lies behind an awful lot of what goes on in markets. That's true. The point is that in those two instances, the state, rather than saying we're going to use incentives to the benefit of the people in the sort of Adam Smith conception of the invisible hand, where we'll have a healthy kind of competition. What happened instead was unhealthy kinds of competition, or in the case of the 2022 inflation, it was a result of excessive government spending and money supply creation that meant that competition resulted in too much money pursuing too few goods. Both of those were just a result of government mismanagement of incentives. And so if you think it's greed, you would have to explain why I mean, I could imagine a meteorologist saying there's an enormous greed front moving across the Northeast. You can see here the scolding winds of greed are going to, that's nonsense. Greed is a constant background factor. So the point is that before I compared voters and consumers and said they're the same people. Well, for some reason, it seems that people who are statists believe that corporate CEOs are greedy. But if they undergo a transformation and they become, say, US senators, now their only concern is for the public. Well, that's nonsense too. The argument is not that corporate executives are not greedy. They are. The public choice argument is that US senators are greedy also. We're all human beings. We all pursue ends. Now, the incentives that are created by an electoral system, a bureaucratic system, and a market system, those three settings are quite different. So in a market system, I only make profits if I produce things that other people want to buy. In a political system, I can produce revenue for the government just by appealing to the worst nature of voters and saying, we're going to tax these people that are bad. Don't tax me. Don't tax you. We're going to tax these other people. Bureaucrats recognize that they cannot be fired for not doing something. So I apply for, I want to build a new factory. I want to have a new kind of product. If the bureaucrat approves it and it turns out that there's a problem, then the bureaucrat will be blamed. If, however, the bureaucrat says no, that's just fine because bureaucrats don't get any part of the losses that they impose on the public. So if I'm a corporate CEO and I don't invest in something that would be profitable, someone else is going to invest in it and I end up losing those profits. I actually may lose my job. Bureaucrats don't face that same kind of incentive. So all of the incentives are asymmetric for people who work for the government. You rarely can get in trouble for doing nothing. You can get in trouble for doing something. And the main thing is that if you work for a bureaucracy, you want to have a whole bunch of people working for you doing nothing. You would like to increase the number of employees, increase the size of your budget. We want to build a new main office building. I would like to have an airplane that I can fly around and show how important I am, make public appearances. So all the incentives are for bureaucracy. Well, let me put it this way. Almost everything that I, as an economist, think of as a cost, bureaucrats think of as a benefit. Everything, if we increase the number of people who are basically doing nothing except not approving new petitions to be allowed to create economic value, that seems terrible to me. If we increase the number of rules that restrict, Lena Khan of the Federal Trade Commission has bragged about how many mergers they have blocked. That seems terrible to me. Everything that I think is a cost, bureaucrats think of as a benefit. And so the reason that the bureaucratic system tends towards inefficiency is that all of the incentives are either to do nothing or to drag things out. And the incentives are to try to increase the size of the budget, the size of the spending, the size of the government sector as a proportion of GDP. I think those things are costs, but if I was a bureaucrat, I would probably think they were all great because my incentives would be those things benefit me.
All right, so that now brings us to Doge. What is Doge and what are its proclaimed goals? If I'm saying if we just take them at face value, meaning what they say? What do they want to get done?
I think no one knows. And as you said at the outset, it isn't clear. And to be fair, this is a new idea. They haven't even taken office yet. Let's be fair. Let's be charitable. Let us grant them they have nothing but the best intentions.
Yes.
And so what it appears is that Doge, after all, stands for Department of Government Efficiency. Now, departments in Washington are the cabinet offices. These are very high prestige offices. If you're a cabinet secretary, if you're the Department of Agriculture, Department of Defense, this is a very important official that has to go through Senate confirmation. There's a bunch of big buildings. They get a limousine and a driver. They get an airplane. These would be heads of corporations in the private sector. So that this is a very large, new, important bureaucracy that we're considering establishing. The rules, presumably, of the Department of Government Efficiency would be to examine the budgets and activities of other agencies to see if there is a way that spending could be cut or the activities of that agency could be improved in terms of efficiency. And so they're going to make suggestions. They will have no power to implement those. All they will be able to do is to say, we look here, it looks like this spending is wasteful. It looks like this activity is not necessary. Some of those budgets and some of those activities, it is possible could be cut or reduced by executive order, but very few, because these other entities are, after all, departments. They're on the same level. It's going to require an act of Congress. That is, Congress is going to have to pass legislation amending the existing legislation that creates and enables. Every agency has an enabling legislation in the book of laws. We'd have to look at that. We would have to strike this. Congress would have to say, in next year's budget, we are going to reduce your spending for this activity, because all of the activities of these agencies are mandated in the budget. So they're being told by Congress how much to spend. So the idea of an agency looking at another agency saying this is inefficient doesn't matter at all unless Congress acts on it. But the reason they're spending that to begin with, and now we're back to everything that I think is a cost, they count as a benefit. So the Department of Agriculture, let's say, is providing money for a large research organization in Kansas to investigate new kinds of seed for corn. Well, I think that would be better done in the private sector. It's unlikely that government scientists are going to do better job of that at the private sector. Those are things that you can capture through profits. I think that's a cost. The senator from Nebraska thinks that's an awesome benefit. There's a bunch of people in my district that are renting buildings, paying rent with federal taxpayer money, and there's hundreds of people that work there, some of them making several $100,000 a year. All of that's good. So almost everything that I think is a cost as an outsider, politicians want to count as a benefit. So I think Elon Musk thinks that when they identify this and say, look, grateful public, you should immediately thank us. We have identified wasteful spending. They all knew it was wasteful spending. They just think that's a benefit. That's not a surprise.
In addition to the problems that you've laid out in terms of incentive structures, there's two things that come immediately to my mind as to why I'm very skeptical of this. The first is that this sort of thing has been done before. I remember the Simpson-Bowles Commission was going to get together and they were going to figure out how to solve the debt problem. The problem is it didn't matter what they recommend if Congress just won't do it because they want to stay in office. And no matter how much the public in general says that they want spending cut, when it comes to their specific programs, they don't want them cut. The other reason I'm skeptical is the only way to really make a dent in deficit and debt, or in the size and scope of government, is to tackle entitlements, which Trump has specifically said he will not do. He's also not going to decrease the Pentagon's budget for sure. He is likely to increase that. So I just don't see there being any possibility that this organization is going to lead to any real cuts. Now, Trump, of course, can just say, "Oh my God, they've done incredible work. I've done incredible work. Everything's great." And people, that follow him will believe him, but that doesn't alter the truth of it. But what I also wonder is, do you foresee any possible harms in addition to just not accomplishing their goals? Is there any positive harm that can come out of this organization?
There's a lot to that question. Let me see if I can unpack it a little bit.
Sure.
So the if you want to know about bureaucracy, you should start by reading Ludwig von Mises' famous book, Bureaucracy. And in it, he points out something that's very disturbing for reformers. And that is, I mean, basically, it's a much better elaboration of what I started here with, that bureaucracy is the organizational form of the territorially expansive state. There is no way that a large state can operate without bureaucracy. If you want a large, powerful state, you must, ipso facto, want bureaucracy. Now, there might be ways to restrict the areas in which bureaucracy operates, but if in addition you want a government that does many different things, there's going to have to be a bureaucracy responsible for each of those separate areas. Now, it has been fashionable for a long time to appoint a commission. The only thing worse than a new bureaucracy is a commission. We'll have a blue ribbon committee and they will meet and they will issue a report. I can't say how many times as a faculty member I have heard a university administration say, this is a real problem. It's time we stop fiddle-faddling and appointed a commission to study some of the contingencies of toughening our rhetoric on this question. It means nothing. So the over and there have been at least 5 major attempts to do this. In the 1920s, the 1930s, the 1950s, the 1970s, and much of the Reagan administration, and then, the Simpson Bowles. In every case, the result was either the proposals were ignored or spending was actually expanded. And so what Mises said, and he's right, is that we can't think about cutting or making more efficient. Bureaucracy is inherently inefficient, but that's the price you pay for saying, I want the state to do this. The only question is, should the state be doing this or not? And that's not the question we're asking. Is this properly an activity where the state belongs? Now, the 2 ways of thinking about that at the federal level, I would say, are first, could the private sector provide this better? And maybe you can use vouchers. We're worried about ability to pay. There are some ways that you could say, well, we'll try to even things out in the private sector, but this is going to be a private activity. The second is, would this activity be better carried out in the states? So the 10th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution has been just systematically eviscerated, where the powers of the federal government have expanded and expanded. So another thing we could say is, and I think this is true of the Department of Education, there's nothing in the Constitution that talks about the police power for the federal government. Federal government has absolutely no business in education, which, given the vernacular of the 18th century, was police power. That is something that the policy that we make at the state level. So the states are welcome to have different kinds of educational establishments. If you want to have block grants to help some of the states fund this, that's okay. But there shouldn't be regulation. I actually think it's literally unconstitutional to have a Department of Education. So the one difficulty is the one that you mentioned about this series of commissions that are unlikely to accomplish much. The other problem that you raise, and rightly, is that what would the cuts even look like? No one has any stomach for cutting across the board. And I actually think cutting across the board is a mistake. I'm a fan of Tyler Cowen's idea of state capacity libertarianism. I am too a state capacity libertarian. What that means is, first we have to have a debate. What should the state do? And those things the state should do well. The state should actually provide good services. One of the things that I've mentioned in some of the things that I've written, I think it may be coming out next week at AIER. was the state of North Carolina, in order to get a driver's license, you have to wait 6 hours after having waited 3 months to get an appointment because they don't have enough employees at the Department of Motor Vehicles. Now, why is that? And the reason is that the state governor and the legislature are having a big fight over budgets, and both of them recognize that the way to make people the most upset is not to provide this service very well. Well, if you've tried to get a passport, if you have tried to get immigration status, if you have tried to get a question answered from the Internal Revenue Service, you're trying to do your taxes. You have a relatively simple question, you call the IRS, and you cannot get that question answered. So as it stands, these agencies either shouldn't exist, or we ought to have enough employees that they can actually provide the service that we're requiring citizens to go to them for. So do we want the IRS or not? Well, the tax code's really complicated. That's on the Congress. We probably can't do without the IRS. And so we should fund the IRS very thoroughly so they have new computers and they have people that can answer questions. But a better solution would be to make the IRS irrelevant by amending the tax code so we don't need this complexity in the first place. But that shows you how difficult this task is. The solution is a simple tax code. Saying we're going to cut inefficiency at the IRS by finding ways where they're spending too much on paper clips is nuts. That's not going to help anything. Already, there's a very long wait to get any kind of question answered from the IRS. So I am worried that we're going to fiddle around and, as you say, make things worse. What we're going to do is have across-the-board cuts that are going to make it impossible for these agencies to provide the services that the Congress requires us to go to Congress to obtain. And it's true that will cut spending at one level, but there's two ways of thinking about spending. One is the amount of money that it takes me to pay taxes. The other is the amount of time and aggravation that I pay waiting in line or hoping that I will not get audited by the IRS because I couldn't get my question answered. Those are implicit. So what we're worried about is money. What we need is a better, more efficient bureaucracy that provides better service. And I don't see anything about that in Doge. So I actually think it's going to make it much worse. The level of service and the confrontation with the arrogant bureaucrats of the state is going to get much worse because they feel beleaguered. They feel isolated, like everyone's blaming them for spending money in order to enforce statutes that are so complicated and so difficult to understand, and Congress won't change them.
Okay, so up until now, everything that we've talked about to me seems pretty obvious, but it isn't to a lot of people. The next sort of area I want to delve into isn't so obvious to me. And let me just give you a little bit of the preliminaries. When Trump started running in 2015, I was surprised that so many conservatives took to him, that people that are conservatives would call him a conservative. I mean, if I look at, say, Edmund Burke or William F. Buckley Jr., George Will, Barry Goldwater, whatever, this guy is nowhere near in that tradition. And there was always a conservative skepticism about what government can do, how quickly it can do it. That Trump was probably the radicalism of what he wanted to do just seemed obvious to me, but conservatives fell for it. What I have found even more baffling, I never would have predicted that libertarians would fall for this stuff. But now we have the caucus and party has basically endorsed Trump. They're touting RFK as libertarian. They're extremely point. They have pushed to have Trump Toadies get nominated to positions of power. I mean, Matt Gaetz is just a yes man, and they really wanted him in there. And they're celebrating this as if it's already happened. I mean, I've had them actually say to me, well, Trump has sure would get, and it's just like, how can libertarians buy this? And I just wonder if you have a theory. I mean, I know you're not a psychologist, But, much has been made of the woke mind virus, but it seems to me that there's a populist mind virus or a Trump mind virus, something that's going on that I'm just not getting.
Well, I'm not really getting it either. I was a delegate to the Libertarian National Convention this year in Washington, and two of our speakers were Donald Trump and RFK, which is kind of hard to explain why a party national convention would have prominent candidates from other parties in to give main keynote speeches.
Right.
And the Libertarian Party has basically endorsed Donald Trump. A lot of libertarians have just said, I'm going to remain with a Libertarian Party registration, but I want to help with the Trump takeover. So libertarians were never conservatives. You really asked two questions. One
Yes.
is Trump conservative? And the other is, if I may paraphrase, what the hell are the libertarians doing?
Yes.
Those really are two separate questions. For conservatism, I think most conservatives still don't like Donald Trump because he is not a conservative in the tradition of Edmund Burke, Ronald Reagan. In fact, a lot of Trumpists just mock the young national conservatives will mock Ronald Reagan. However, if you look at the results that Trump has delivered, particularly on the Supreme Court, there is a conservative, not Trumpist, Supreme Court. And
That's true.
that's an enormous benefit. So I've actually heard people say, I don't like Trump, but he got us the court. I've got to give him credit. I never expected that. There's a 6-3 majority on the court that is not, they're conservatives in the traditional sense. Many of them are Catholic. So if you were a national conservative or if you were concerned about Christian conservatism, Trump, in terms of what he has done, not what he said, but what he's done, has delivered something that was completely unexpected and is going to change U.S. policy for 2 decades. Now, I don't really see any reason to be grateful about that. I think that was just an accidental byproduct of thing that Trump was doing anyway. But okay, fair enough. Let's say Trump has done something for conservatives. It's the what the hell are the libertarians doing question that mystifies me, because I don't see Trump having delivered anything.
No.
Now, it happens that I am pro-choice. A lot of libertarians are pro-life. That's fair enough. Reasonable people can differ about that. But I do not consider the Dobbs decision to be a giant thing that has been delivered to libertarians saying, and now we live in a libertarian utopia. What I think the reason is that many people who were libertarians had already abandoned the Constitution. And so within libertarianism, there are two different groups. Libertarians who basically have become anarchists and think that we're going to have to break the system and rebuild it. And they think Trump might be able to do that because he's better at breaking things. He's dedicated to breaking things. And the others who, like me, are classical liberals. Classical liberalism believes that the US Constitution, while not a perfect document, does provide a set of rules that gave more protection to libertarian sentiments and action than any other governing document that's ever been created. And so we can live with that. We can live with particularly the Bill of Rights, with the protections that we get against for speech, for religious practice, for illegal search and seizure, for due process. Those are all libertarian principles to me, but they're not to a lot of other libertarians. I would say most, and I don't have any survey evidence for this, but I would say most people who consider themselves libertarians at least liked Trump a lot better than they liked Harris, and in many cases preferred Trump over any alternative.
See, interesting you brought up Harris because I recently had a discussion online with a libertarian influencer. And I said to him, okay, you have a strategy that entailed supporting Trump. What are the metrics we can use to judge whether this strategy is a success? Is the debt going to go down? And I said, these are my predictions, and I'll happily admit if I'm wrong. I think the debt's going to increase. I think there's not going to be any cut in regulations. No departments are going to go anywhere. He's going to ramp up the war on drugs. Those are easily verifiable positions. And if I'm wrong, I'm fine with it. His response was, well, Trump is better than Harris, which is a counterfactual that we cannot know because she's not going to be elected. He is. And then he said these metrics are just silly. There's no way to go by metrics like that. And somebody else chimed into the chat and said, things are too complex. We can never know those types of things. And my answer was, well, it seems to me you're misapplying Austrian economics. You're taking the Austrian observation that with a complexity of phenomena, you can't just look at events because you're not holding all things equal. You can't see a clear cause and effect relationship. You have to do it logically to figure out what it is. But that's not what we were talking about. We were talking about measuring the success of the Trump White House. And the way I ended up resolving it was to say, so basically what you're saying is there's no way that you're ever going to admit you're wrong.
There's no way they could be wrong.
No, because you're just saying he's better than Harris. I know that. There's no way to prove it. And all these other metrics are silly. And then I see on X, Angela McArdle, the head of the party, touting the fact that libertarians, first of all, I think this is a ridiculous claim, but even if you take it at face value, it's still ridiculous that the chairman of a party would say it. She says in 2028, we're going to get to play kingmaker in the Republican primary. That's the goal, to be able to choose. And she actually mentioned, I think, Tulsi Gabbard, Robert F. Kennedy, and Vivek Ramaswamy. So the goal of the Libertarian Party is to be able to influence the Republican primary 4 years from now, and that's your success?
In Angela's defense, what has the Libertarian Party ever accomplished? Because that's the answer that they are going to give. They're going to say year after year, in a really good year, like with Gary Johnson, maybe we get 3%. Our goal is ballot access. And we don't get included in debates. None of our policies get implemented. We're just living off in our little separate treehouse. We're proud of our irrelevance. And anyone who actually wants to affect politics leaves the Libertarian Party in frustration and then goes and joins one of the two state-sponsored parties. Yes, that's bad, but maybe you can have an effect. It's time that the Libertarian Party recognize that it should be part of a larger coalition, because often a small party in a coalition can have power that is out of proportion to its size if the other coalitions are other elements of the coalition are relatively even in size. So you've got populists, you've got conservatives. They're basically the same size. 2 or 3% libertarians can say, we're going to choose this candidate or this candidate in the primary, and the result is we'll have more of an impact. I think that's the argument that she is trying to make, compared to the almost total lack of impact that the Libertarian Party has had, which many people have grown frustrated with. I haven't, because I think it's better to try to have, and I'm a long-term libertarian. I have been a libertarian now for more than 20 years. I run for office every year. I ran for office. I lost that. I can lose many offices, but I lost North Carolina House race, District 40. Thank you for all the people who voted for me. I recognize that it is the lot of so-called third parties not to have enough votes to be able maybe even to influence the outcome of the election between the two state-sponsored parties. But Giovanni Sartori, the famous Italian political theorist and political scientist, famously pointed out that another way for third parties to have an outside influence is to make the two state-sponsored parties, in this case, confront the fact that they have forgotten their basic principles. So having a libertarian who's able to get on the radio, to run ads, to be able to participate in politics gives us a chance to say, there are Republicans who are saying that they're for liberty. They're not doing what they say. There are Democrats that say they think that we own our own bodies. They're not doing what they say. And so I think libertarians have had and continue to have an outside influence on the intellectual and debate front. The fact that we haven't won anything means that we should not say the best that we can hope for is what political scientists call the lote. What McArdle wants to do is to vote the lote. You've got a bunch of really bad candidates, but we'll pick the lesser of two evils, the lote, and that will make us the kingmaker. Well, it's true that increases your influence, but all you're doing is choosing different devils in hell. I want better
Right.
choices. I don't want
Yes.
to say I got to pick the particular devil in the political hell that I have chosen to live in.
In full disclosure, I called myself a libertarian for over 20 years. I don't any longer because well, I was incarcerated, and upon being released after 25 years in prison, I came across the Mises Caucus and I realized this is something that I want nothing to do with. They just don't represent my principles
They don't represent
at
Mises.
all. No, not at all. That's even worse. But not only that, their method of communicating I found to be woefully distasteful. So I don't call myself a libertarian and I'm not a member of the party. But as far as the strategy goes, well, the Libertarian Party doesn't have any influence. I want influence. Then leave the Libertarian Party. That seems to me that would be the thing to do, the ethical thing to do. And the idea that, well, they're going to have influence, it seems to me the influence goes the other way. When you're now touting a lifelong Democrat, an obvious statist who wants to regulate the food supply like RFK Jr., and you're saying he's a libertarian, you're being influenced. You're not doing the influencing. So I think it's just a bad move on their part. And my biggest fear, and whenever this sort of thing comes up, and my biggest fear, for instance, I'm a disciple of Ayn Rand philosophically, and there are objectivists out there who endorsed Trump. And I don't begrudge anybody that votes, like you said, for the lesser of two evil. These are tough choices. I'm not here to judge anybody for that. But when you endorse Trump and buy into his lies and his nonsense, my fear is that an outside observer who doesn't know much, that's just maybe getting interested in libertarianism or objectivism or capitalism, and that's what that person sees, that's not very enticing to me. Maybe it will be to them, but even if it is, what have you won? And my answer is you've won nothing. I would rather, and it doesn't mean you can't vote. It doesn't mean you can't make practical choices. But you don't have to go and endorse this guy or set your goals as influence in the Republic Party. I hope I'm communicating that effectively. To be honest, the whole thing kind of irritates me, so I may get a little scrambled.
I mean, the problem is you and I think, agree. There's probably about 7 other people who agree with us. That gives us 9. We're not persuasive. My libertarian and in some cases objectivist friends do not just vote for, but rather endorse Trump and say he's actually great. He is perfect. He is the person who is going to lead us to the promised land. I don't want to go to that promised land. That is not my vision of how society should be. And I do think that the increased push that Trump got from having gotten a significant amount of the popular vote and control of the House and Senate means that we're going to tear down a bunch of things that are going to be hard to build back up. So one of the rules, I have told this story after Trump got elected. I have a number. I'm a professor at Duke, and unsurprisingly, most of my friends are on the left. And so a couple days after the election, one of my lefty friend comes in, closes the door, and says, I was reading the Federalist Papers. There's some good stuff in there. Well, yeah, there is about separation of powers. That's great. My question is, why 2 months ago, when your guy was in power, wasn't that same good stuff in the Federalist Papers? And he said, well, I really wasn't worried about it then because our guy was in charge. That's the thing you're missing. If what you're going to lose an election, your side's not going to have 1,000-year Reich. Your side's going to lose an election. If you concentrate power in the state, if you concentrate power in the person of the president, even if you think, let me grant that Donald Trump is a person worth concentrating power in. I don't believe that, but that's not the point. Even if he were someone worth concentrating power in, he's serving his second term. He can't run again. He's really old. You should never make a sword so big that you don't want to see wielded against you immediately after the next election. What we're doing is creating a giant, really sharp sword by concentrating power in the person of the president and getting rid of all of the institutions that prevented the president from being able to act. When the next Democratic president is in office, there will be lamentation and rending of garments on these people who are now endorsing Trump, because what they want is a very short-term idea. We can win. Our side can obtain the things that we want by concentrating power in this person that we believe in. That has never worked. That is not liberalism. It's not classical liberalism. It's certainly not libertarianism. The libertarian has to forbear the temptations of the ring of power, because the ring of power will seduce you and you will end up being the opposite of what you intend.
Well said, Professor. Before I let you go, can you tell the people where they can find you?
Well, I have a podcast called The Answer is Transaction Cost, where I talk a lot about problems that markets sometimes solve and sometimes could solve better with entrepreneurs. So the podcast is called The Answer is Transaction Cost. And then my Twitter account, which is pretty idiosyncratic. I found that I make almost everybody angry because I'm like Treebeard. Treebeard famously, I think they asked, whose side are you on? And he said, well, I'm not entirely on anybody's side because no one is entirely on my side. My Twitter account is at Mungowitz, Mungowitz, at Mungowitz. And I'm sure there's something there to make others angry too.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for being with us today. It's been a great discussion.
It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
For now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. Till next time.